if you're struggling to shift that final few pounds of stubborn belly fat that sits at the bottom of your belly, it's not just about calories in versus calories out. It's about fixing what's going on internally so you can perform externally. And often we overlook stress. So I'm going to tell you exactly why, in 4 steps, stress is making you gain belly fat, or actually preventing you from shifting those final few pounds of stubborn belly fat. And it starts with digestion, but also storage. Essentially, any food or drink that we consume mixes with what I like to call little workers. Now, there are hundreds and thousands of little workers, enzymes, which catalyze specific reactions in the body and help us to digest, process, metabolize, and even store the food and drink that we consume. What we need to understand is that food and drink is converted into a tiny molecule called glucose. And glucose is actually transported via our blood, which I like to call the London Tube Network. We have thousands of train tracks which are distributed across the body, left, right, and centre, from the top of your head all the way down to your big toe. And on those train tracks we have trains, but of course we need to get those passengers to their correct destination. And these are things like oxygen, vitamins, minerals, cholesterol, catecholamines, and most importantly, glucose, because the body needs glucose. So glucose is used as a fuel, and any excess glucose, so glucose which is not transported to its specific destination, we'll come on to that when we look at insulin resistance in the cell, it's stored as a glycogen in your liver and in your muscle. Think of that as an energy reserve, almost like putting money away in the bank every single month. You use a specific amount of money to pay for bills, or perhaps to go out to a restaurant, a cafe, and then that's your emergency lifeline. You then store that money away in the bank for a rainy day. Now, moving into number 2. We've got 2 different states within the body. They are namely the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. But we're going to refer to them as rest and digest versus fight or flight. And I want to give you a scenario. I want you to imagine that you are on Amazon Prime and you are scrolling to find a birthday gift for a family member. You manage to find that birthday gift and Amazon have said, okay, it's next day delivery. So the next day comes and they've given you a delivery time. Let's say it's just after 12. Amazon are quite specific. Let's say it's 12:30. And it's just on 1 o'clock and Amazon still haven't delivered that parcel. You're getting a little bit stressed. You're wondering, why have they not delivered that parcel at the correct time? So you're pacing back and forth, but all of a sudden, you hear the doorbell ring. And you rush to the doorbell, you open that door, expecting it to be your parcel. And it's in fact a lion sat at the front doorstep. It's something you wouldn't expect, right? However, because you didn't expect it, you have now activated the fight or flight response, your sympathetic nervous system. That is acute stress. It's a survival mechanism, and if we think hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we were cavemen, when we were cave women, our basic instinct was to survive. We were hunters and gatherers. And based on that evolutionary mechanism, we have adapted in today's society as mankind. Now, stress can come in a variety of different forms. It could be the lion on your front doorstep. It could simply be stuck in traffic. It could be seeing something on the news, perhaps the weather outside, something that someone has said to you. Perhaps you're in a room full of people who you feel a little bit uncomfortable with. These are all forms of stressors. And acute stress is pretty good for us. Like I said, it does help us to adapt. However, What I like to refer to stress as is flicking on a switch. When you flick on that switch, that's acute stress. However, the longer you leave that light switch on, the electricity bill starts to climb, and that bulb, it begins to burst. That is chronic stress. And chronic stress can lead to making you gain belly fat. And the reason for that is because on our London Tube network, it creates barriers, which means those trains can no longer get to their correct destinations. Those barriers are caused by two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. They are troublemakers. They are what cause the delays and the London Tube strikes. So the body needs to think quickly about this. How do we actually get those passengers to their correct destination? More importantly, glucose, because we understand that glucose can be stored as glycogen in the liver and in the muscle, but also it can be stored as two different types of fat, subcutaneous and visceral fat. If you take two fingers, you pinch on your stomach, you pull away that skin, there's a little bit of fat. And a little bit of fat, pretty good for us. We are biological machines. We need to regulate our body temperature, whether it's hot or whether it's cold. Think about polar bears in the Antarctic. They have a little bit of blubber, right? To keep them insulated. But too much fat, detrimental to our health. And that's why we see a close association between obesity, high BMI, and type 2 diabetes mellitus. So cortisol and adrenaline impact those trains and whether they get to their correct destinations. But more importantly, those passengers are getting quite angry on the train. They're wondering whether they're going to get to their destination. And they can't just disappear from the blood like a magic trick. Abracadabra, you wave your wand, it disappears. It doesn't work like that. So where does glucose go? Where does our glucose passenger go? Well, we've got an increase in blood sugar. And the reason for that is because when we are in a fight or flight state, not only do we have the glucose passengers on that train, but the liver, that stored glycogen, that emergency fuel reserve which we need on a rainy day, the liver now releases or breaks down glycogen into glucose, and it releases it into the blood. So we now have hundreds of different glucose molecules in the blood alongside our glucose passengers. And like I said, it can't just disappear, it has to go somewhere. So it's either stored back as glycogen, it's either used readily via a process called glycolysis, or it's then stored as subcutaneous fat or visceral fat. And visceral fat is the dangerous type of fat. Yes, a little bit can protect our organs, but too much fat is detrimental to our health. If we think our heart, if it had a high amount of visceral fat, it's not going to be able to contract and relax and distribute blood across the body. And that's why we see things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attack, angina. So number 3, this leads to insulin resistance. Because your pancreas produces a hormone called insulin. And insulin is what regulates our glucose and takes it from the blood into your cells. Think of it as like an Uber driver and glucose is a passenger. Glucose has actually booked the Uber, and the Uber just needs to take glucose to its correct destination, the cell. But there's something going on with the app. The app isn't working. The driver can't find you. We refer to insulin as a key or a taxi or an Uber. So if those keys are not working to unlock the cell and transport glucose from the blood into your cell via something called a GLUT4 transporter barrier, then we have a big issue. Represented in the green are all those glucose molecules. So once again, glucose doesn't just disappear from the blood like a magic trick. Abracadabra, you wave your wand, it disappears. It doesn't work like that. So because we have high blood sugar levels now, the pancreas is still producing more and more insulin to regulate your blood sugar levels. But our keys don't work. there's something wrong with the Uber app. The taxis are not picking up that glucose. So once again, it leads on to increase in subcutaneous or visceral fat, an increase in glycogen. But number 4, most important one, visceral fat relocation. So we can actually see here in this green segment, this is a visceral fat and it sits behind the abdominal wall, whereas at the front is subcutaneous fat. So that's the fat that we can pinch with our fingers, with our skin. The visceral fat is the fat that we don't see. It's naked to the human eye, but we might feel it. So not only do we have that increase in subcutaneous fat and an increase in visceral fat, but this massively impacts our energy, our focus, our clarity. We feel sluggish. Your abdominal fat cells actually have 4 times more cortisol receptors. So what does that mean? You are always going to be in a fight or flight state unless you start to focus on this thing up here. You start to reduce the background noise that is society. Yes, you can focus on things like increasing physical activity and exercise, getting your steps in, perhaps doing some cardio, eating well, moving more, because all movement matters and every minute counts. But if you don't learn to flick the switch and actually manage your overall stress, then no amount of cardio, steps, resistance training, or nutrition is going to fix losing that belly fat. So what can you do to actually reduce stress? Well, yes, you can go out for a walk. 30 minutes of vitamin D, sunlight exposure, the sun hitting your skin, the wind blowing your hair can reduce stress, anxiety, and depression by up to 30%. And I highly recommend that you do that in the morning, because then you can regulate your circadian rhythm and you can regulate specific hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Now, I've referred to cortisol and adrenaline as troublemakers, right? But often they are good because they've helped us to survive. It's a survival mechanism, switching between a fight and flight state or a rest and digest. Let me give you another example. If you're walking to your local supermarket and you've got a zebra or a zebra crossing, and that's where you know cars should stop either side to let you go, and often some of them don't. You begin crossing that zebra or zebra crossing and you can see a car coming round the corner and it doesn't look like it's going to stop. And it doesn't stop, so you jump out the way. That is your fight or flight response. That's your sympathetic nervous system kicking in and increasing your cortisol and adrenaline. So you no longer need blood pumped to your gut to be able to facilitate digestion and storage. We need energy that is readily active or available to combat what's going on. We either fight in that situation or we flee. So that's why the liver releases that stored glycogen and breaks it down into glucose, and we release it into the blood. Journaling is absolutely huge. Brain dumping, getting your thoughts down on notepad and pen. That can hugely benefit you when it comes to actually understanding what happened throughout your day and actually process your thoughts, your behavior, your body's physical response, and any emotions that you had. The biggest one when it comes to stress is actually financial worries. So having a clear plan of action, understanding your outgoings versus your ingoings can also help to reduce the amount of belly fat. Once you fix this thing up here, everything else gets 10 times easier. If your mind believes it, the body will achieve it. And there's a lot of psychology that comes down to behavioral change. But the most important thing is actually managing your thoughts, because they do affect your behavior, the actions and the steps that you take every single day, your body's physical response, so whether we are activating a fight or flight pathway or a rest and digest pathway, and then the emotions that you have afterwards, serotonin, dopamine, those feel-good hormones, which can once again impact the amount of belly fat that you store. If you enjoyed this type of content, make sure to like and subscribe. For more daily fitness tips on how you can improve your health, your hormones, and also your habits to lose 5 to 40 kilo of belly fat, build lean muscle, and actually improve your overall health through nutrition and managing things like stress, you can find me on Instagram at JackFitCoach. And for a bonus, if you want to DM me the word stress, I'll send you over a completely free guide on how you can improve your overall stress hormones, which could be the reason you are gaining belly fat or struggling to lose the final few pounds of stubborn belly fat. Thank you so much for watching. I shall see you in the next video.